Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Black Health Trust. We're so happy that you chose to spend some time with us, and we have a very informative program following up on something that we have the perspective to appreciate, and that is the developments along the lines of long COVID. So without further ado, turn it over to our founder, Dr. Randall Maxey, who is on mute.
Good afternoon. I always say good morning, but good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Dr. Neighbor Stevens and Dr. Ivan Walks and Dr. Hines, our co-moderators, and our very prominent guest speaker, Dr. William Lawson. So we talked about topics, and he said he had a hot topic ready to go on the issue of cognition. And we know that cognition affects all human beings, but I'm especially worried as I get to be more senior, how cognition will affect me in general, but especially with all these pandemics going around. And we know that cognition is an effect of your awareness of what's going on. And I did read some articles that showed that after episodes of COVID and other illnesses, that you can actually lose IQ points, which I wasn't aware of. Between 3 and 9 points of IQ or your intelligence. We know that use of certain drugs can use to neuron dropout and affect your ultimate intelligence. But we're going to ask the master to talk about some of these things. Can you put up my slide, Simon? Is Dr. Walks on?
Dr. Walks is on, Dr. Maxey.
Dr. Walks, as usual, can you help me read his introduction?
I'm happy to help you read his introduction, and I'm happy to be here to learn from Dr. Lawson. All right. Health and cognitive ability. Dr. Lawson, you need to just stop. All those initials after your name are just an indication of how much you know, and it's a lot. Dr. Lawson is founder and director of the Institute to Reduce Disparities, LLC, director of psychiatric research for the Emerson Clinical Research Institute, professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at George Washington University School of Medicine, and adjunct professor of psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He is an emeritus professor of psychiatry at the Dell Medical School, University of Austin, Texas, and emeritus professor, formerly chair of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Howard University. He received a PhD in psychology from the University of New Hampshire and his MD from Pritzker School of Medicine, University of Chicago, did his residency at Stanford University and a fellowship at the NIH, National Institute of Mental Health. You guys can tell that I know Dr. Lawson well.
Are you going to leave time for his lecture, Dr. Walks?
Well, no, I'm just saying that half of the bio was off the screen and I still knew all of it. I've known, let me just add one little personal note. I've known Dr. Lawson a long time. He's one of the smartest scientists and physicians, and also one of the most approachable and kind people. And getting that combination of humanity and scholarship in one person, it ain't ordinary. So I'm always happy when Dr. Lawson joins us. And now let me leave some time for his lecture. Go ahead, Dr. Lawson.
Thank you very much, and appreciate one point that you did. When I first started thinking about this, it brought back memories of my previous career. Some of you know or did not know, I used to be primarily a research psychologist, had no interest in terms of clinical care until fairly later, thanks to my father's kept saying, you ought to be a doctor, you ought to be a real doctor. But before that, I got involved clinically in terms of dealing with the IQ controversy. So when I started looking at the literature, I was shocked to see that a lot of things that I thought had been long resolved had reemerged. And I think now especially It's going to be important in terms of those of us who are providing services for folks who suffered from COVID crisis. I'm just going to very quickly go in. Some of you are already well aware of this. There was an outbreak of COVID, no built-in immunity, reliable vaccine. I'm sorry, can you see that? Gotcha. Or no confirmed treatment. And I became interested, especially when I made the observation. Are you seeing my slides or the next one?
See,
Which,
seeing your
oh,
slide.
there we go. Right. Because what COVID did, it not only demonstrated some problems in terms of our health delivery system, it rewoke old controversies that we thought we had resolved. There were unresolved issues in mental health and substance abuse. We've heard from Dr. Chapman in terms of his concerns, in terms of chronic diseases. Dr. Max has done a good job in indicating that. And what we find is that this is not just like having the flu and then you're going home. Having pneumonia, you take some penicillin and you're gone. We found that it had psychiatric and neurological complications, loss of olfaction, loss of gustatory sense, but also a brain fog kind of syndrome, the etiology of which is still not clear. But there's emerging evidence showing that there can be problems in polyneuropathy, myopathy. Some folks have developed ischemic strokes as well as nausea and ageusia, the olfaction and taste. And there's evidence now that there's hypothalamic and cortical neuron innervation, which is a special interest to our group because we are working with the olfactory system in terms of using odorants to try to improve cognitive functioning because of its tight ties to the hippocampus and the limbic system. So what's going on is there's almost certainly infection of the nervous system, dysregulation of cytokinic activation, as well as some effects in terms of autoimmune mediated mechanisms, as well as neuronal injury, and of course the spread of the virus itself. So I guess it shouldn't be a surprise to us, and I guess we didn't have technology at the time when we had the epidemic of almost 100 years ago, that this disease isn't just one that's one and gone for some people with ongoing problems. We already are well aware there's strong mental health links. Hospitalization rates went up now and ran up when the disorder first appeared. People have ongoing sleep disturbances, chronic depression, and of course dizziness, difficult focusing at work, as well as neuropsychological changes. And so again, it's clearly pronounced increase in terms of not only neurological disorders themselves, but there are also neurological changes that are a lot more subtle. So we now recognize the phenomenon of long COVID. Some people think it's multifactorial, that there's not just one complication. And these long-term effects broadly defined as signs, symptoms, conditions that continue to develop after the acute infection. They're still trying to work out the phenomenology in terms of long COVID versus the other complications, but I think that's going to be very difficult. I suspect it's probably a multifactorial causes in terms of what's going on. In addition to that, there's an ongoing problem of, is these long-term effects COVID, or is it something else? And what we now recognize is that, in fact, probably there are other neurological disorders that may occur that have very kinds of similarities. And I'm just going to see if that's visible on the slide over there. Yeah, the one of them is disorder called a peculiar disease that a gentleman named Alzheimer's discovered. It was a profound memory loss and microscopic brain changes, disease we now know as Alzheimer's. Now, I just want to say long COVID and Alzheimer's are not the same disorder, but tremendous overlap. And in fact, what we found is that some individuals who think that they have long-term COVID, in fact, may have early onset Alzheimer's. Just to say a little bit about Alzheimer's, this is an important disease, at least in psychiatry. First African-American psychiatrist was a gentleman named Solomon Carter Fuller, who worked out the pathophysiology of this disorder, the neurofibrillary channel complications. And it's important in our community because it is twice as likely as occurring in non-Hispanic white Americans. And in fact, African Americans have the highest risk of dementia in general to any other U.S. ethnic racial group. This has broad implications because if you think of dementia as something that's inevitable, something that's that is primarily genetic, what we're finding is that it's not quite the case. The good news is that dementia itself is not inevitable and is not simply related to permanent changes in the brain. But of course, the bad news is that these are difficult disorder in which we don't have many treatments at all. The bad news is that it was still very difficult in terms of working out the differences between the dementias and being able to predict the long-term outcome. A person that has long-term COVID, long COVID, may in fact may not be very distinguishable from early onset Alzheimer's and other disorders. Just a few points of what we recognize about Alzheimer's. We used to think of it in terms of the relationship between ApoE genetics and as a risk factor for Alzheimer's. And I think that was a tremendous advance, a very important advance, because we now have a genetic marker. But the other side of it is that we used to also think that the type of ApoE, ApoE4, predicted whether or not you would have it. But now we know it depends on your racial and ethnic group. In the study that was involved, actually my wife was also involved as well. We looked at individuals in Abadan in West Africa and found out that the ApoE4 risk factors for Caucasians was not the same thing as for Africans. And we brought it back to the US, lo and behold, not the same for African Americans. There is an increased risk, but it's not the same as the Yoruba. And probably it's related to the fact that dementia in African Americans are also heavily associated with the increased phenomenon of health disparities that we've often talked about in this program. The higher cardiovascular risk, hypertension, diabetes, and metabolic factors. So what that has shown us is that in terms of Alzheimer's, and we may find out we'll turn the same thing in terms of why there's this increased risk of long COVID, is that it's not the genetic factors that's going on, it's ever outside risk factors that's been associated with comorbidity of a number of disorders in African Americans, hypertension, diabetes, and so forth, which are important in terms of predicting, it seems, a variety of conditions, including dementias and cognitive impairment. And in fact, when we control for a lot of these conditions, a lot of differences tend to disappear. So what we find in Alzheimer's is that genetics only accounts for half of the risk for the disorder, and it also shows that in fact there are modifiable factors in our environment that we can change that may change the risk for Alzheimer's. Diet, physical activity, smoking cessation, cutting back on alcohol, and so forth. All of these factors, we modify them, we may be able to remove that disparity that's going on. And again, the question that's related is, why are there disparities in our community in terms of risk for cognition and dementia? Well, it's not only these biological factors, but there's also some factors that's going on as well in terms of pre-existing issues. I want to go back to my time machine in terms of what we frequently talked about, and that is the unique reality of history that African Americans face in our country. The fact of racism and its consequences, the disparities in terms of access to care and support, and these all time of epidemic-like features in our community. Went well aware of the impact of slavery, and I went and did a little literature search that surprisingly was more difficult than I thought. How long did, and a simple question, how long did slaves live? Found that it's got numbers that said that life expectancies were around the 20s. And it didn't talk about the long-term consequences of slavery in terms of quality of life, so forth, and so on. But what it is showing is that it was a very brutal system in terms of survival. And even though slavery is gone, we still have black codes. We still have today ongoing disparities in terms of the treatment of African Americans. Poverty still exists. We always talk about the gains that we made, but if you check the literature, talk to the socioeconomic economists, you'll note that the disparity between the wealth of African Americans, especially family wealth, and the wealth of whites, there's still a huge gap. In other words, many of us do not have millionaire grandparents that can help bail us out of jail or keep the court system honest. Instead, many of us are first generation in which we were making any kind of serious money. And what we find is that the economics of African Americans is such that we don't have the family wealth. Many, despite Obamacare and other systems, many folks still lack health insurance. I again remind folks that advantage of the DC area is that they do have expanded Medicaid. I've lived in Texas for a while where they did not have expanded Medicaid. And you had many times a third of the people who had to live out of pocket. Then there are environmental factors that we often fail to take into account. Many of you saw the stories of what happens when you play professional football. You have prolonged risk of head injury. Well, a colleague who's recently passed, Carl Bell, found the same phenomena in many of our African American communities, and that is many of our young people are exposed to chronic head injuries. We've already talked many times on this show about the importance of diet. Also, what we often tend to forget is that African American communities tend to be in areas in which are highly polluted and in which there are toxic waste. And yes, lead is still a big problem, and still controversy in terms of how you're going to get rid of the lead pipes in many of our African American communities, which there is known risk for cognitive impairment to our young people. And of course, we recently were getting recognized limited sunlight. Our melanin is a very good protector in Africa, but what we're finding is many folks do have vitamin D deficiency because of just not being out in the sun enough and not eating fresh fruits and vegetables. And let me move to the next one. Oops, okay. Then also there's interesting factors, the social factors. We've had several talks on these, probably need them again. TV time. African Americans disproportionately spend a lot of time watching TV, and the TV becomes a parental mind support. Why is that? Because we had to work. Those who are working had to work 2, 3 jobs, and some of them don't have the parental time that's necessary. And as a result, there's limited parental exposure. And it's well documented that interaction between infants and young people and is a very important factor in terms of cognitive development. Educational quality, trying to make great gains, but that's still a tremendous struggle in many of our communities. Test wiseness. I remember when I was in school, kids say, "What is this, a paper and a pencil? What is this for? Don't you just talk?" And what we find that many of our communities, folks do not get exposed to frequent tests. We talked to some of my white colleagues who were loaded from having cognitive testing back when they were infants. Sleep deprivation. Some work done at Howard University at Alabama, and I was showing that many folks in inner city communities are chronically sleep deprived because of the noise of the community, noise in the street, as a result of the volume of noise, which in fact has an impact in cognitive functioning. And as I said, diet, food deserts, we're well aware of in our community that this is an ongoing issue. And all of these are all tied into this. It's not that nobody likes Black people or attitudinal issues, what we call structural racism, which is built in the system and limits access to care. It existed, by the way, before the pandemic, but became exacerbated by the pandemic. The phenomena of redlining, why do folks end up living in areas in which there's a toxic environment? Why not just go somewhere else where it's nice and comfortable, where you don't have to be exposed to that? And again, it's related in terms of housing access, cost of housing, which again has become a problem, as well as the idea of misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis. We well recognize this in mental health, recognizing it in terms of developmental disorders, and it's an ongoing issue in terms of our elderly, which is in terms of trying to deal with misdiagnosis and underdiagnosis of cognitive impairment. And we're also appreciating weathering chronic exposure, not just specific events that cause post-traumatic stress disorder. Chronic exposure to attitudinal issues such as racism has an important effect in terms of bodily function. As the body wears out. I frequently talk to patients who look at me and say, "Oh yeah, you young guys, you're really doing well." And then find out the patient's half my age, weathering, poor diet, drug abuse, produce clear-cut biological changes in terms of aging, even at the level of cellular metabolism. Folks get old fast. Mm. Then, just wanted to mention some of these issues wrote in my book, which is added to the Journal of National Medical Association. Book is available on Amazon. So what we run into is an interesting narrative. That is that the slaves were thought to have a limited mental life, and after slavery and afterwards, the idea persisted that African Americans simply weren't very bright and had limited thought. We didn't get depressed because we didn't have the cognitive ability. We had limited ability to learn. Because we had limited ego control, we were more impulsive and more violent than the general population. And because we were thought to be intellectually impaired, our educational opportunities were considered worthless. We couldn't experience depression. We had low income. We were impulsive. Because we had dealing with a stressful environment, but didn't have the mental capacity to deal with it, returned to drugs and alcohol, couldn't afford housing, can't make rational decisions, and had to turn to criminality because we couldn't survive in appropriate socially acceptable ways. And those who saw the recent movie about the Indian tribe, which is one of the wealthiest people on the planet, but at the time they all had to be. They thought they couldn't manage their money, so they all had to be designated as dependent and had to be linked up with a white person to manage the money. In some way, that's happening still in our community. But that many African Americans simply do not have the capacity to manage money, money managers, and as a result, have to need some help in financial issues. The fact that many of our schools don't have teach those skills. I mean, don't get them from the families, because again, remember, most of us first, second generation families with money is often ignored as an important factor. So how are Black folks viewed? This is just, I found one commercial, there are lots of commercials showing this. This is an African American. That's how you advertise to us because of the way in which we are. In addition, a colleague of mine went back and looked at his book, Protest Psychosis, same thing in terms of mental illness. We were considered dangerous, impulsive, and so we had to have strong medication in order to manage ourselves. These factors are also implied in terms of how the society dealt with African Americans. And again, it's not just what people are saying right now in this instant, but this has been, these are long-term issues. Our immigration policy built on the idea that there are certain racial groups that are intellectually inferior. And so it's fairly recently, I think it was during the Carter administration, that allowed to have fewer African ancestry immigrate to the United States. The need for redlining to protect white community, income communities from Black folks. So we had housing covenants. Certain former presidents, Farmer, pushed those to make sure you didn't get stuck in a place with these, what they felt were subhumans. The whole concept of school segregation, as one who was raised in the schools segregation system, it was an issue. I often wondered about it. It was a reality, but then no one seemed to have a good explanation why it existed. And it doesn't make much sense. I didn't know that intellectual achievement was like a pandemic, and if you're exposed to it, your IQ points would drop. And yet that was the working assumption for school segregation. And of course, the district for a long time had social segregation as well. So we had a segregated system, which a heavy underlying factor was the belief that African Americans were somehow intellectually deficient. So we were, and another aspect of this was that because we had disparities in a number of ways, we felt that it was required that we keep us locked up so we can't go out and get involved in mischief. And so our jails and prisons were held with people with mental disorder and substance abuse because it was felt that African Americans simply did not have very good impulse control. And so we're talking about 400,000 people, mental disorders are incarcerated. We don't, and when I later found is that a lot of these folks not only have mental disorders, but they also have autism and other developmental disorders that are not treated, are not addressed in the mental health, in the correctional system, is what is not African American. So how do we address these? Well, clearly we need to look at the policies, the resources, education, and clinical models. But a big factor was the whole issue of race and IQ. I just threw up these names because when I was growing up, I was frequently exposed to them. The gentleman named Jensen, Hernstein and Murray and Shockley, who had a tremendous impact in terms of American policy. In the first part of this century, folks sought ways to test cognitive function in order to see if it was worthwhile to educate everybody in the population. And they developed a test, which really was a series of tests that we would now look at as self-tests in a neurocognitive sense, but which was working on the assumption that there was something called a general G factor, overall IQ. And if you measured a number of these factors coming together, you get the score. And the score would tell you how intellectually competent the person would be. It was felt to be genetic. It was felt to be invariant throughout one's life. And also, it was felt to be a powerful predictor of where one would end up in society. So we can talk about the U.S. not being a class society or a caste system, but in fact, the IQ testing used in many ways to define class. You had a high IQ, you were a good person, going to make tremendous contributions to society. If you had a low IQ, you had to be isolated from everybody else. And there was a lot of testing in World War I, also a lot more than World War II. And one thing that was noted earlier was that these tests confirmed what everyone already suspected. African Americans, certain ethnic groups, I think Swedes, Latinos, had low IQs, whereas, and these were supposed to be biological, and they were used then to justify policies of racial, ethnic segregation. It was also used to determine funding as well. There's no point in trying to educate somebody they can't be educated. We had a gentleman named Jensen, educational psychologist, another one, Hernstein, who brought in with a Nobel Prize winning physicist, Shackley, who helped develop the transistor. They said that intelligence was important in class, and it made no sense to have to try to help people who were intellectually deficient because it was genetic. So this was a hypothesis that, frankly, is held by many people today, and that is that there are certain people, Shaka called them people are color-coded, who had low IQs, and there was everybody else who had high IQs. And these folks just made no sense to put a lot of money in terms of trying to address their deficiencies. And of course, Jensen and others said that money spent on compensatory education programs and a lot of other programs were extravagant. And we had Nixon and others who wanted to demolish, does it sound familiar? Demolish programs who were promoting educational equality. The rationale then was that such programs were worthless, even though there's clear-cut evidence that these kinds of beliefs just didn't make sense. For example, it's been now shown that IQ scores have been increasing every generation. The so-called Flynn effect. Some of us think it's more what we call test-wise effects. Now that people have been exposed to cognitive testing, they learn how to do well on them. Are people smarter than those? They probably not, but we know how to do well on tests. And so we're finding that scores on everybody is going up. So, and then we renorm the tests as people do better. So Black folks now would have scored well above average 30 or 40 years ago, but don't do as well now because the tests have been renormed. they found that certain try to control for socioeconomic factors, look at Black or mixed race children and see what happens in Black homes than white homes. And they find that you change that environment, the adolescent test scores rise dramatically. And also, you would think that Black folks who mated with white people would be smarter, but we don't find that case at all. When you look at European ancestry among African Americans, those that have a lot and those that have little, look at genetics, you simply do not find big differences in terms of performance differences. Similarly, when we looked at American soldiers who fathered children, German children, again, didn't find any significant difference. So whatever the genes that are involved, they don't seem to make a huge difference in terms of cognitive performance. And there's another whole discussion of head size. There's been a belief that the bigger your head, the more intelligent you are. Or the bigger your brain, the more intelligent. They try to look at species differences, but that ran into a problem because elephants and whales have bigger brains than human beings, and yet, for as we know, they haven't developed a substantial technology. And they try to say, well, it's body size, but birds have disproportionate brains in terms of their body size. They're bright, but not as bright as humans as far as we can determine. Same way with shrews and certain other small rodents. What we also find, and what's very important, is not just, this is actually Jensen found this, that students, when he came in the room, students did terrible on tests. But once they got comfortable with him, they did much better. And what we find is that when teachers have high expectations, lo and behold, kids do well. When they don't do as well. So when providers are more pessimistic, folks don't do well when they interact with them. They're less likely referred to special programs, and they believe that social dependency is inevitable. So immediate intervention is to spread the word that kids can have hope, can be rehabbed, and that everybody is capable of living a full and independent life. So what we need to do is look at the issue of access to culturally competent teachers. And that's important. We say, well, if a person looks like you, they're culturally competent. Not necessarily. Their environment experience may have been totally different, may not be related to what you're at, even though they're well-meaning. And unfortunately, students recognize this and you see it in their performance. Evidence-based instructional techniques. Now there's been a lot of pushing for new techniques, but many times they're not evidence-based. There's no evidence that they work. And as a result, many times instructional techniques, especially in our communities, may not have been shown to be very effective with our folks. Lack of contact with mental health and substance abusers. Excuse me. In one community I was in, the idea of a school psychologist didn't exist. There just weren't any. Now we recognize the importance of them, but again, as many will tell you, the number of students that are assigned to them their patient load is extensive. The same way with substance abuse providers. In many of our communities, in many of our settings, correctional system, educational system, and others, even though we have substance abuse is a major killer of Black folks, young people simply do not have access to those who can provide treatment. So we got to get our physicians, who are providers, in partnership with counselors, social workers, psychologists, lay people. Got to get them involved. because many of us encounter many folks in the community, but may not have the social and psychological support that we can provide them to see how they're doing. We got to educate our community about nutrition and exercise. I used to think that I had to work hard to lose weight, but I was amazed at the number of 300-pound people, and they're just unbelievable, who are not football players. We need to do more. We have the technology now to really make a difference in terms of nutrition and exercise. I still have to come. Just one struggle. I injured my leg recently. Every time I walk by somebody, I say, "Oh, put in a wheelchair." But that's a sure way to get insufficient exercise and shorten your life expectancy. So if you're not doing the elderly a favor by putting them prematurely in wheelchairs, we got walkers and other techniques to keep them from falling. We got to have prevention programs for substance abuse and chronic disease. We got to have access to primary care associations throughout our community and many of our folks. Many other countries with less resources than the U.S., notable example would be Cuba, for instance, found that they didn't have the resources to spend money on healthcare like we do. But putting a primary care clinic in the community has made a huge difference. And we got to have student counseling and behavioral health services. Student counseling, surprisingly, is absent in many of our HBCUs, as well as in terms of high schools and others. So we also need to develop screening programs done in a non-punitive way. I hear folks say we got to screen for the murderers, the killers, the criminals. Yeah, but then what are you going to do with the information? There's now a new test that's supposed to predict who's going to be a substance abuser. What are you going to do with the information? So we need programs for cognition and screening, especially tied in to taking making interventions that work. And we got to remove barriers to care by screening for cultural mistrust, as well as health literacy. Amazing how many folks do not have basic health literacy, and of course get their health literacy information from weird YouTube stores or not from their primary care providers. And we need to reduce stigma in terms of mental disorders, academic, and just look right dead in the eye and say, this kind of work is not for me. So we need to, again, do what we can to recognize that not everybody's going to be a basketball player. We got to engage folks in community activities to promote greater understanding of disparities and access to care and prevention. As Dr. Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. And another book, I hope it's still in the press, that we did with disparities in psychiatric care is also available for Amazon and other places. Thank you. Yeah, I hope we got some time for some questions or comments.
Well, thank you again. I really appreciated your lecture, but I have to say I'm mighty angry after listening to some of what you had to say about the disparities. And I wonder how much of this information that society puts on Blacks is psyops to keep us in a disparate condition. But just briefly, could you just review for us what does IQ really mean and what does cognition really mean before
IQ is intelligence quotient, and it basically is a series of tests, of cognitive tests that you set standards for based on your age range, and you have a quotient that comes out. The average person should be able to get all the things scored at the right point. It was an IQ of 100. If you don't get half of them right, your IQ drops down to, I guess, 50 or 60. So it's a quotient of how you perform. It used to, we used to use norm for the overall population. We found that because of age differences, that we need to have norms based on various age groups. So that's the difference between the Stanford Binet test, which is One widely used test is heavily used was the Wechsler Adult Scale, which is used in terms of adults. Again, the Stanford-Binet, you have to it's standardized based on how you perform in terms of where you are by age. The Wechsler is based more in terms of the population.
Can I just add, Dr. Maxey, to what I think is part of the answer to your question? The
Yes.
way that IQ has been used over the years, folks would use it to predict whether you were able to learn a certain amount of stuff. And if your IQ wasn't high enough in someone's mind, that would mean that they didn't think you were going to be able to do certain things. And so they wouldn't even try. They say, oh, your IQ is not high enough. You shouldn't try to do this, or you shouldn't try to do that. And that kind of an attitude ignores all of the things that Dr. Lawson just educated us about why you can't just take that test and label someone with what their potential is going to be. Is that fair, Dr. Lawson?
Unless you mean to do them harm.
Yeah, the test was developed to determine who was worth educating. Basically, that's why it was developed. And so we said, well, these people who have low IQs, considered mentally retarded, there's no point in putting a lot of state resources to educate them. No point to it. And so they expanded that to me. It's also no point to provide a lot of social services to these folks, because it's not going to make them better.
Well, then your question is, I'd like to make sure we get some audience in.
While we're opening up the mic, I just want to say, I've said before that I'm a very concrete person. And I just want to say that I grew up under the influence of the effects of applying the IQ rule. In our schools, if you had a certain IQ, you went into the class that was going to be prepared to go to college. If you didn't have that IQ, you were put into the classes that would track you into vocational activities. And if you had an even lower IQ, then you were classified as mentally retarded, and you were in a third track of classes. And that was the way public education was structured in the South, and especially in segregated schools where I attended. So I just want to drive the point home. Now, given that, along with all the other misinformation that has been put out over the years, it's no wonder we're having to fight still. I won't say fight again. The fight never ended. All of the assumptions that are made about the capacity of Black folks in this country. I just had to say that.
Okay, do we have any questions in our chat? I want to make sure we get some audience in.
Is there one quick one that is that and then there was fifth group, they ended up chronically institutionalized. And also and then Dr. Walton, you probably remember this, in California, they had tracking in terms of different school levels. The Association of Black, and it was required that everyone take an IQ test, and that's where you ended up. The Association of Black Psychologists led an initiative to remove IQ tests as the basis for where one is in the educational system in California. It's not happening around the country, but at least in California, they passed that policy, and it made a big difference in terms of where folks ended up in school.
So Dr. Maxey, we do not have questions in the chat that I can see. I think a lot of folks are probably just stunned that this continues to be an issue. This is one of those things that we thought shouldn't be an issue at this time.
So I had a teacher that I call my godmother, Frances Cress Welsing, who debated Shockley all over the country and kicked his butt. And she had this thing called the Cress theory of color confrontation, that spoke to certain inferiority complexes of the major race, the master race, so to speak. And this accounted for many of their creations of things like IQ and the other disparities that we see. I'd like you to comment on some of that.
Yeah, I frequently talk with Dr. Wellesley. We've discussed and debated it. Yeah, her basic theory was that white people were generally, and I found out later that it was based on some factual data. White people were generally afraid that they would be wiped out or replaced by Black people. And unless they made policies to be able to keep the number of Black folks from increasing, and yet at the same time recognize that the features that make us Black are dominant genes, and therefore work desperately to keep from mating with them. And this, by the way, is a heavy drive in terms of South African policy and many and several other countries. And she felt that part of what's happened is that in order to make sure that we stay under control, policies were set up so that we were taught and we were enforced that we couldn't achieve that she felt that we were taught to fear money and that we would not that it would not be in our interest to try to achieve. And she's found support for that also. And you must remember the work by that led to the changes in the segregation laws in this country, in which the Dow test was done, which showed that African Americans actually believed that they were inferior and could not achieve. Kenneth Clark's and his family, I think, was a key feature in terms of promoting that. So these are long-term policy issues. It isn't just your office. These are issues that are determining how we live our lives in this country as I speak today, in terms of how we're trying to deal with these issues. And unfortunately, they are not going away. We still have redlining. We still have segregated communities. We still have less effort to preserve the intellectual functioning of Black folks, even though we know we have even more data showing that the environment can have negative effects in terms of our cognition, and chronic deprivation of certain foods does affect cognitive function.
No, thank you. Dr. Neighbor-Stevens, Dr. Walsh, any other thoughts?
I want to share something that happened to me yesterday, which I have been thinking about ever since it happened. And I do believe that it has a direct relationship to the history that we have been discussing today. Yesterday, I was at the Mac's counter in the department store. For those who don't know what Mac is a brand of cosmetic. And I cannot remember what I said that made the sales clerk ask me, but we were talking about cosmetics. And she said, she asked me, what school did I go to? And I cannot remember what made her ask me that. So I just very calmly said Harvard and kept on talking. And she kind of gasped and said, you must be really smart. I just kept right on talking. You know, that to me, the miracle to me was that she didn't say, oh, you must have gotten in because of DEI, but she might not have even known about DEI. I don't know. But what I suspect is that it was the underlying thought of our inferiority. So, you know, those microaggressions happen all day long. Fortunately, I'm strong enough to withstand all of them. And hopefully we can help our young people develop some of that resilience, because we're going to show need it.
Amen.
Dr.
Oh,
Walsh,
so you want me to make my final comments, Dr. Maxey? I got some final comments.
I know that.
Look, look. Somewhere in the Bible, there's language about there's nothing new under the sun. And I want to take all the incredible scholarship that Dr. Lawson shared with us today, and I want to take it back to something I heard back when I was a little kid. We have to work twice as hard and we have to be twice as good. That's for me, that's the bottom line. I can't wait. I can't tell my children to wait. I can't tell my grandchildren to wait for things to be fair. And I can't complain about things being unfair. I can vote and I can work to make things less unfair. But while I'm doing that, I've got to continue to tell my kids, my grandkids, and anybody else that I come into contact with, yes, sadly, it is still true. Don't sit home crying about it. You got to work twice as hard and you got to be twice as good. So, sorry, kids, it's 2024 and it's the same as it was in 1964.
Thank you. Dr. Neighbor Stevens.
I've made my last statement.
Well, to our famous guest, I'm going to pose a question, Dr. Lawson, with understanding that we are a 501c3 and can't really deal with politics in the sense of Republican, Democrat. But this week, there have been a lot of protests on college campuses regarding what's going on in the Middle East. And there's some in that protest who are equating being against Zionists with being anti-Semitic. There are some who are equating the lack of response of the President of the United States with being pro-Israel and therefore against Palestinians. And I just like your psychiatric comment on those issues, because many people are saying they'd prefer to have certain individuals who are avowed racists being charged rather than another gentleman who just happens to be elderly, because you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
I appreciate your comments.
Well,
In a non-political way.
I'll do it in a non-political way. I think one of the issues that everyone seems to have forgotten is that 10 years from now, these folks aren't going to disappear. They just aren't. And Israel is having a real problem right now in terms of having somebody out there doing the work, working their fields and so forth, where Palestinians have a real problem in terms of getting resources. So even when this comes to an end and they run out of money for weapons and so forth, somebody is going to have to develop a stable social situation in which people will be able to thrive. Unfortunately, time is not on their side. Many of us are aware that, especially the environment of that area, there are real issues in terms of having enough resources for both populations, which are growing, as well as for food and water. So none of the politicians, I'm sure they must be aware at some intellectual level, seem to be aware that that's really what's going to be happening. It's not what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, the hostage release, not happening. It's what's going to be happening the next couple of years and the generation that's going to come afterwards. And unfortunately, if you look at the history of that area, you see that lack of thinking ahead has been a real issue for both sides in terms of dealing with this. And this also another statistic is that the parts of the U.S. literally running out of water. We have parts of the country in which the population such that it can't sustain job growth. So there are some larger issues that are emerging that even when students go out, take their exams, go home, that's still going to be going on. And they are going to have to figure out some solutions to deal with it.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody-
Dr. Maxey,
Yes, sir.
so you know that I always try to help you as you balance on that line about what's okay to say, right? I just
Yes.
want to read something that is part of the United States Department of State working with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, of which the United States is a member. And I want to read a definition of anti-Semitism. That's approved by this organization. It's a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. And I want to give an example of what they say, this organization. Manifestations might include targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. That's where we stop. The other part of this is that contemporary examples of anti-Semitism cannot be criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country. It cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. So, as people criticize the policies of a country, we don't like Putin and Russia invading Ukraine, we can say that we don't like Israel as a country doing some of the things that it's doing. And we can say that about the country of Israel without being anti-Semitic, because the language that was adopted is criticism of Israel similar to that levied or leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. And I think sometimes we get very much caught up without going back and doing the academic research to make sure we know what the words we're using mean.
Let me go a little bit further on that, Dr. Walsh. I'm glad you brought those points up. But if I'm correct, anti-Semitic would include not only the Hebrews, but the Arabs and anybody from that area. But
That's not actually accurate, Dr. Maxey.
it is very accurate. I don't care
Oh,
what
it
that
is not.
committee said.
Then there's no need to discuss it.
Yeah. So Semitic does not just apply to Jews and Hebrews.
That is your opinion, and we are allowing you the privilege of stating it, even though it's incorrect.
It's correct. Thank you.
I
Have a
gave
good day, everybody. Have a
Dr.
great day.
Maxey, I gave the reference, and so that is the reference that I'm using.
But we
But-
agree to disagree.
Dr. Maxey, I love you. You're my brother. We absolutely have to disagree. My mother said, if two people agree on everything, one of them is not needed.
All
Yes,
right.
just
Everybody
remember
have a great day.
All right. Good day, everyone.
that.
I
Thank you.
Simon, sign us off before we get in more trouble.